Pigments of Imagination are a wonderful new type of layerable ink that are exclusive to my website at janedavenport.com. And I want to show you this fun project of creating a little crowd of gorgeous inky people clambering along in their mystical gorgeous pigments of imagination. Each of these colours is named after a mythical or mythological, let's say, entity or creature. And the names are such because the ink itself is a little bit magic. It's a lot magic. Now, what I need to tell you first off is that I am using a special type of paper from my collection called Glittering Prize, and it is a shimmer infused watercolor paper. So you might see a little bit of glitter or glimmer, shimmer, as we are creating. That's not in the ink, that's in the paper itself. You could add potentially a little bit of shimmer into the ink with maybe some of our fairy dust. But the pigments of imagination in and of themselves dry to a really lovely velvety, matte, but still vibrant colour. The formula is very unusual and they are unusual, and you will feel extremely creative while you're using it. That's how they make me feel anyway. So what I'm doing here, I've splashed down a little bit of colour. Usually if I start something on a page and I get a little bit of splash happening, a drip happening, it just reminds me that I love inky splashes and drips, so then I just start adding them on purpose. So that's where we started, and then I'm just adding these different inks. Now in thicker application, depending on the paper, you're going to get a little bit of bleeding sometimes. It just depends on the colour, but it happens specifically with elf and let's say kitsune, which is a fox spirit from Japan. Oh, look at that. I've added a little bit of water onto the page and just dripped that ink into the water puddle, and it's shot off like magic. And I'm just adding various other colours here, such as goblin, and who else have we got here? Selkie and Bunyip, and we've got Pixie, Elf, Ondine, I think we're up to now, Yeti. These are all different creatures. But with this technique, I can put down water first and add my ink into my little figures here, but I'm just creating some little stripes of colour, basically. If I can get the ink a little bit broader at the top and going down to a taper, it's going to emulate more shoulders coming down to the legs. But as you'll see these little people evolve, the shape kind of doesn't matter. As long as it's longish, it will read as a person at some point. This beautiful, I sort of think of it as a candy or bubblegum pink, but it does have a little bit of a mutedness, because I do have other pinks in other collections of inks that are very clean, bright colours. And with these ones, I wanted to make them a little bit softer, along the lines of the Gods and Monsters, which have a softness to them. But these are a very different formula. These dry with a water resistancy. Some of the colours are absolutely waterproof, and some of them are really just water resistant. They're as water resistant as we could make them without losing other qualities. And you can test the colours, but even the ones that move, that can shift a little tiny bit, I would still describe as being water resistant. Now I can't fit all of the colours along in a line just here, but I wanted to get them in their brightest version so you can see them. And see, even as they're drying and they're not fully dry, those first ones, you can see they're not bleeding. Now if that was watercolour or some of my other inks, we would have bleeding up into those other colours. And I'm using Yowie, which is a sort of like an Australian version of a Yeti, and I think this was nymph or will-o-wisp. I think that was will-o-wisp actually. Just to add some different little skin tone faces as well, flesh-coloured faces in all their variety. And then I'm layering a little bit in there. Now, before they dry, they're going to blend with each other. Once they're dry, they're not. So that's going to give you glazing capabilities with these very translucent inks, which is very exciting. I do have the Incredible inks, which is semi-layerable, and I have other inks such as the Ink of the Mermaid markers and Creative Juice, the Feeling Inspired sets, and Gods and Monsters and Legends of the Sea, different types of inks. They are water soluble, so they will keep layering and moving with each other. Every time something's put on them, they will bubble up again. And the amount that happens depends on the paper and on the ink itself and how dry they are. These, the Pigments of Imagination and the tattoo inks, are my permanent or layerable inks. So once they dry, you can add another layer on top, and what's underneath isn't going to come to life. But they're not opaque. So you're not going to, say if you put down a flash of red and then you put down, the beautiful Kitsune colour, like it's a dark tanny red, or Phoenix in this collection, and then put Jackalope, which is a gorgeous ochre yellow. If you put that yellow over, it's not going to be a yellow stripe. It's going to mix optically with the layer that's underneath it. So it's going to be like glazing. When you do glazing with acrylics, it's going to have more of that effect. So you can already see where some colours are blending into each other because the underlayer is still a little bit wet, and where some colours just aren't going to blend much with each other, like the little figure here. So I'm getting that demarcation of the blue and the brown. Because that blue has already started to dry. But when I put the Yowie, that little bit of a light flesh tone at the top, was still wet enough to bleed a little bit. So she's got a little bit of a fluffy feather collar happening on her neck there. So what I'm hoping that I'm explaining or showing to you on screen is that these inks, and this is why they have these magical names, these mythological creature names, is because they have a life and a mind of their own. And like many of these mythological creatures, they're not good or bad. They are what they are. And we appreciate them for what they are. However, you can befriend them. And usually with a mythological creature or a fairy tale creature or a folk tale entity, if you are kind and approach them with honesty, you're going to get that returned. And that's how I feel about these inks as well. They are magic. They have their own ambitions and what they would like to do in their art life. But they're happy to be around you as long as you use them and treat them with the respect they deserve. But also with a little bit of caution. What a strange analogy for an ink. Yes, I understand that. But these are strange inks. The colours are absolutely divine. Look at what they're doing when you mix them together. So I'm putting colours together that do strange things. Some of the colours, like I said before, do feather, and in a thicker application. If you use them with a fountain pen, they're just not going to do it because it's just such a tiny amount of ink that's coming down through the ink tines and through the pen nib and attaching to the paper. But when you're using it like this with a water brush, or the way I'm using it here with a brush, I'm applying a lot of ink down there. So it just gives that magical creature way more latitude. You know, give it an inch, it'll take a mile. So it'll start doing things. So this is why it's important to swatch your colours and understand what it is that they're going to do, and then use those particular properties for your advantage. So for me, it's almost like she's got feathery boots on, or like a feathered jumper. And I love that. So knowing that if I apply it in a thick layer, I'm going to get that kind of look to it. It'd just be fun. Now, to get our little crowd of people marching along and give them a little bit of spatial awareness, let's give some shadows just under their feet with a colour called Goblin. This is such a great shadow. So it's got a little bit of a greyness to it, but it does have brightness. And I'm just going to also add some water to it just to soften those shadows out and let some of the other colours bleed into it. So it almost looks like the surface that they're walking on is a little bit wet and they're getting a bit of a reflection in there. You can leave your little figurines like this, or we can add more colour, more detail, let things dry off. Add pencil, add pen. I think I'm going to add a little bit of pastel pencils. This is the Fluffy White Clouds pencil. I'm just going to put little circles in their head. I want to keep things very loose and sketchy like they are. And I might even put in some little spine lines just to emphasize just how their bodies are moving as they're walking along. Maybe that will look like a little jacket, so they've got little outfits on almost. And of course you can use any of the Jane Davenport art supplies with these, or any art supplies that you have. I love mixed media, which just simply means using everything that you have at your disposal. I'm using a little bit of layer cake paint, which is another of my very unusual creations, really. If you're a Davenport, you get it. If you know, you know. Anyway, but layer cake it's in the realm of watercolor and gouache, but sort of like a cross between, the way I think of it, as it's got the creaminess and the opacity of gouache, the layerability of acrylic, and the convenience and joy of watercolor. And it combines my favorite parts of those three media, but it's its own thing. And it's called layer cake because it's wonderful layering it on itself. Absolutely heaven. But it's also fabulous to add a little bit of opacity on top of something else. Now I'm going to add that and it will sit up very nicely. There'll be no color transfer once the colors underneath are dry of the Pigments of Imagination. If the ink underneath is still drying, there might be a little bubbling up. See that figure right in the middle with the very dark blue at the top, which is Valkyrie, and it might be Kitsune or Phoenix underneath, like a red sort of tan brown. All you need to do is just wait for a minute just to let the ink underneath dry, and then we can add other things on top. Or you might want it to bleed up and give those extra colours underneath. I personally like both things. I like all the things. This particular little palette is called the Secret Ingredients. It's a travel-sized version of the layer cake. And as you can see, it's got lots of beiges in it, as well as other portrait colours. And just like the Pigments of Imagination inks, it's exclusive to my website at janedavenport.com. And these inks are part of we call them the JDHQ exclusives, because they are a specialised art supply and perfect for mixed media types. And for those that are looking for something a bit unusual, something a bit exciting in their art supplies and in playing with their rainbows. That was really fun. I love showing you these.